by doing so. The comparison of the Ultras. Now, I'll tell you this much. I think a lot of people, including myself actually, we all collectively believe that the X200 Ultra is better in every conceivable way as opposed to the S25 Ultra. And maybe there is some truth to it, for sure, because the X200 Ultra, Vivo, they in general just have these insane crazy features that go over the top and can sometimes, in various cases, very often, produce some genuinely insane and incredible results that perhaps the S25 Ultra cannot quite replicate, at least not yet. However, I do think that there are various other factors to consider. And more than anything, sure, there can be areas where the X200 Ultra is gonna excel, like detail preservation. I can tell you right now, without even looking at the photos, it's gonna be better than the S25 Ultra. I know that the S25 isn't known for its detail preservation, but there are other things to consider. And essentially, I want to see how far or how close these two phones can be in terms of photography, without human subjects, of course, as opposed to our expectations more than anything else. Now, of course, as I mentioned previously, this comparison does not have human subjects. This is all about the other photography stuff, the color profile, the detail preservation, high res, night mode, all that good stuff. We'll tackle human subjects separately in a different video, mainly because it just makes this one way too long. I have a feeling that this one is by itself going to be fairly long, so having human subjects would just make it way too much. Now, as you can probably tell, the X200 Ultra has this vivid color profile, which I'm sure a lot of people like. I have no qualms with that. It's not my kind of color profile because obviously this is not the kind of thing that I would ever use in my personal opinion. I much rather prefer what we have coming next. On the S25 Ultra, of course, we're just using the regular color profile, the vanilla basic thing that we have with Scene Optimizer, and it's fine. It is kind of saturated, as you can probably tell. Not as saturated as the vivid colors on the X200 Ultra, but it is saturated and it's not my thing once again. Now, the beauty of it on both phones is that you have not just Zeiss natural colors on the Vivo X200 Ultra, which is utterly delicious. If there's one color profile that I can consistently recommend to everyone, it's Zeiss natural colors because it is one of the greatest things. On the S25 Ultra, you also have access to custom color profiles. Now, you have some filters available, but for the most part, I would very easily say that none of those are gonna come close to natural colors. What I would recommend is just literally lower the saturation by 1 and increase the contrast by a little bit. Just 1, that's it, that's all I've done here. It's a very simple thing, very small change, but it makes a huge difference in terms of photography in general. It's what made the S25 Ultra very pleasing to use for the most part of the time that I've used it. So Zeiss natural colors on Vivo and the custom color profile that I made on the S25 Ultra, these are the ones we'll be sticking with throughout the comparison. It's very simple to use, and this is the best possible way to get the most natural colors on these two phones respectively. I think that's what most people want, right? Or at least for the sake of this comparison, it's gonna make the most sense. Now, you do have access to something called texture mode on the X200 Ultra, something to just bear in mind because it just allows you to have this very high contrast, slightly saturated look. It's very stylized, and if you have a situation that is very flatly lit, it's perfect for that. But of course, it's also inconsistent, and which is why I don't really think it's worth using. Now, there does exist another massive difference between these two, which is the fact that the main camera on the X200 Ultra is not 1x. It is essentially a 1.5x optical zoom that we have, as opposed to the 23mm mode on the S25 Ultra. On the X200, it is a 35mm mode. Now, if you have seen any of the previous comparisons, you already know how I feel about this. I think that there are a lot of advantages. Essentially, you get no distortion, you get way better depth of field, the background bokeh with just regular photographs using the main camera on the X200 Ultra, beautiful stuff. But there's also problems. You can't really frame shots as easily as with the main camera and so on and so forth. All these differences exist, and honestly, there's only one way to figure it out. Are you fine with more distortion, or would you rather deal with the framing problems? That's all there is. Now, I actually got a really good chance of taking some really beautiful sunset shots, as you can probably tell. Now, there is only one phone that is doing a good job with this. I think that's fairly objective here. This is not an opinion or anything like that. The S25 Ultra kind of sucks at sunset shots. The S25 Ultra in general will just not perform well when it comes to warm lighting situations. This has nothing to do with the fact that I kind of lowered the saturation manually. It has nothing to do with the fact that the contrast is just a pinch higher. It's like 10% higher as opposed to regular Scene Optimizer color profile that we have on the S25 Ultra. It's a simple problem that has existed in Galaxy devices for ages now. I can't even remember the last time that I saw a Galaxy device produce a well-balanced shot in terms of warmth. But as you can probably tell, regular shots look very good. Regular shots, especially with my custom color profile with just slightly less saturation, they look really nice and really appealing on the S25 Ultra. Maybe not as nice as the X200 Ultra, because X200's color profile and the color science, it is blatantly incredible, but it's fairly nice. Now, the reason I'm showing you this one is particularly because we are using 35mm mode on both phones, which is a 1.5x crop on the S25 Ultra. Let's just say you have the S25 and you want to take a picture with zero distortion. This is the best way to do it with the main camera. So do you lose out on a significant amount of detail? Quite simply, yes you do. Because first and foremost, the S25 Ultra's processing is not very fine-tuned, as opposed to the Vivo at least, because in my opinion, both phones, yes, they have processing, they have a lot of sharpening and all that jazz, but I think the S25 Ultra overdoes it quite a bit, to the point that you end up with way too much artifacting. I think it's very obvious. With just a 1.5x zoom, you're losing out on a ton of detail, and that's not very good, to say the least. Now obviously you might be wondering, well, what if I want to take 23 or 28mm shots with the Vivo? We'll get to that in a moment, because we are going to use the ultrawide camera for that, and you might be surprised by the results. But before that, let's also take a look at regular ultrawide shots that we can get. Once again, if you have warm lit situations, if you have sunset situations, the S25 will not perform well, in the sense that it's not going to accurately replicate that warmth that you really want. At least that's something I would want. If I'm going to shoot a sunset, I bloody well want the warm sunset to be prevalent in there, not just completely blown out as you can see in some of these situations. But then again, if you use the ultrawide in any other lighting situation, the S25 Ultra performs near flawlessly, and it performs really well, to the point that you can very easily compare it to the X200 Ultra. Now, as we have already showcased, the S25 Ultra, if you want to take 35mm shots, you're going to lose out on detail. Is it extremely significant? No, not really. If you're going to just post on social media, you can take the shot, it won't matter, because social media compresses stuff as it is. However, what if you want to do the same on the X200 Ultra but in reverse? What if you want to take a 28mm shot? Maybe a 24mm shot? I would recommend going for 28mm, because essentially you have a 14mm ultrawide and a 28mm would be a 2x sensor crop, in theory at least. And well, whether or not it works, let's find out. Looking at this shot in particular, which was, by the way, not particularly well lit, it's actually surprisingly close. Of course, the Vivo has a lot of processing happening. There's definitely a good bit of haloing and sharpening that's happening, and there's no doubt about that. But considering the fact that this is the ultra-wide camera, that's a good bit of detail that we're getting, especially with a 2x sensor crop. I don't think any other ultra-wide camera can do this. That's the best way to put it. Is it perfect? No. Put it simply, we are close. We're very, very close to that utopia where we can just use the ultra-wide camera for main camera shots as well, but we're not quite there yet with the X200 Ultra specifically. Now, of course, when we take a look at the macro situation, it's a lot more interesting. The S25 Ultra just uses the ultrawide camera, which still blows my mind. The fact that they have two bloody periscopes and they don't utilize a single one of those for a proper, nice macro mode. The X200 has quite possibly one of the best macro modes. It might not feel obvious right now because we are using the telephoto macro and it looks nice, but it's not getting particularly close, is it? Well, guess what? We have a sensor crop on top of the telephoto macro, and it is basically lossless. The telephoto macro that we have on the X200 Ultra is easily the best one on the market. If you have at least a little bit of good light, like this wasn't ideal lighting, but I can still tell you right now, this looks basically flawless. And the S25 Ultra can't even get close to that level of quality, much less just how close you can get to the subject. However, let us now take a look at zoom, because this is where things are going to be slightly interesting. So with 2x, one thing that I can tell you right now is that both of these phones are just oversaturating the absolute crap out of that red on those flowers. It's kind of ridiculous, especially on the X200 Ultra. I can kind of see this happening on the S25 Ultra, but on the X200 with ice natural colors, it's oversaturating. That's unfortunate. Especially when we zoom in, you can see the artifacting that we are having there. Now, there's a different approach happening with 50mm mode on both of these. Essentially, the X200 Ultra, it's kind of processing and bringing out more detail, but also looks overprocessed. The S25 Ultra is doing kind of the opposite. It's looking a little smudged out and less detailed, but also slightly less processed. But then when it comes to the 3x on the S25 Ultra, let me tell you right now, it is possibly one of the worst 3x telephotos that we have. It's a measly small 10 megapixel 3x that we have. It's just not good. Plain and simple. There's way better basic 3x cameras out there. The 3.7x on the X200 Ultra is one of the best on the market, so there's not going to be much of a comparison, which is of course case in point. Like, the sheer amount of noise and grain and lack of detail that we have on the S25 Ultra, it's staggering. Now this was once again in almost a backlit lighting, and it just really exemplifies the difference in hardware quality right there. Yes, I'm sure there's a lot of processing happening behind the scenes as well, but there's a certain level of threshold that the hardware must reach before the processing can properly take over. That's not happening on the S25. And then of course we have the 5x. Now the 5x sensor, oddly enough, is actually really good. It's one of those sensors that works really well on the S25 Ultra, and honestly not much to complain about there. However, how does the X200 Ultra compare with its basically industry leading sensor that we have on that one? Now, cropping all the way into 500%, it's very obvious that it can keep up the X200 Ultra. I do think there's a little bit of motion blur or something of that sort happening on the X200, but there is also a whole load of overprocessing and oversharpening happening on the S25 Ultra. So essentially you can say that the Vivo is slightly less processed and maybe a pinch less detailed, but it's the opposite on the S25 Ultra here. Now of course, more than anything else, what I'm very interested in is just how well can these two phones perform with high resolution, because one of the beautiful things about the X200 Ultra is that high res is very relevant, because the X200 Ultra is able to utilize high res alongside Zeiss natural colors, so you get the best of both worlds, literally, and that's not something that I've seen on any other smartphone thus far. And well, the unfortunate thing that happened for some very odd reason is that I managed to frame things up fairly similar. It's not perfect, but there's motion blur in this one. It bothers me so very much, but this is only the 50 megapixel mode, and I'm sure that more than anything else we are wondering about how well the 200 megapixel mode fares on the S25 Ultra. Now weirdly enough, the 200 megapixel mode, same subject, same positioning, it has no motion blur problem. So I don't know what happened with the 50 megapixel mode, it makes no sense. And well, essentially what I can tell you is that even with 200 megapixels, it actually looks like slightly overprocessed on the S25 Ultra. The X200 Ultra on the other hand, I like the fact that it's not sharpening anything. It does look very slightly less detailed as opposed to the 200 megapixel S25 Ultra shot, but honestly it's more pleasing because it doesn't have the processing and the sharpening. Now with the ultrawide camera, it's actually very interesting on both phones, because the X200 Ultra, it has the exact same sensor as the main camera. Now the processing isn't mature enough to properly utilize that sensor to its fullest and absolute degree, especially with the ultrawide camera. But then on the other hand, with the Galaxy S25 Ultra, we have had the biggest upgrade to the ultrawide camera in the history of Galaxy devices, at least that's what I think. Well, let's just say it's not as close as I would have hoped it to be, because honestly speaking, I had really hoped that the S25 Ultra with its brand new ultrawide and one of the highest quality ultrawides that I used, at least in the first quarter, well, I kind of hoped that it would be at the very least similar quality as the X200 Ultra. I know the sensor is not as good, but kind of hoped that the processing would do some heavy lifting. It's not doing nearly enough is what I can tell you, because the X200 Ultra is miles ahead. And now of course for our telephoto cameras, I am using the 5x on the S25 Ultra because the 3x doesn't even have high res, so there's no point in this comparison, in this particular part of the comparison, for us to even consider the 3x on the S25. I just framed it up to be as close as possible to each other, because that is a pain in the ass, let me tell you right now. And we are also using the 50 megapixel bin down mode on the X200 Ultra, which, as you can probably tell very simply, has significantly more detail and better dynamic range too, as opposed to the S25 Ultra, which I didn't expect the latter. I expected the detail to be higher, and we do see more processing and more sharpening on the X200 Ultra, but of course, bear in mind, we do get a 200 megapixel mode on the X200 Ultra. Now we already saw how the 200 megapixel mode with the main camera works on the S25 Ultra. It's not bad, but it's not the greatest thing on the planet. It doesn't, in my opinion at least, as opposed to what the X200 Ultra can do, it doesn't, in my opinion, produce as much of a difference. When it comes to Vivo, I can very simply say that the difference between 50 megapixel mode and the 200 megapixel mode, it is night and day. The reason I say that is because more than anything else, yes, there's a little bit of noise reduction and smoothing happening on the X200 Ultra for sure, especially given the fact that this isn't ideal flat lighting condition where it would give you the best possible result if you were to shoot in those lighting conditions. But what I can tell you is that the X200 Ultra, it really ramps down the over sharpening more than anything else. It still produces a ton of detail as opposed to the S25 Ultra, obviously, but the amount of sharpening definitely goes down quite a bit. The smearing is present, especially in this lighting condition. It seems to be much more obvious, but I would say that it is definitely performing a lot better than the S25. And now of course we have our night mode. Now the situation with night mode is actually very interesting on both phones. So on the X200 Ultra, Vivo, finally, they gave us this beautiful access to all the color profiles that you could have asked for. Now, in general, I would always recommend using Zest Natural Colors because that is exactly what I'm using here, and it gives you the most consistent, some of the most natural looking nighttime shots. But if you want the maximum amount of contrast and you want just the most inkiest, darkest, beautiful looking night skies, then I would actually recommend going for textured mode. It will produce some overly high contrast, maybe some slightly oversaturated images sometimes. The inconsistency will be there on the X200 Ultra, but well, if you want style, the X200 can provide that as well, just letting you know. The S25 Ultra, on the other hand, it doesn't really give you access to proper color profiles, but it does produce some beautiful, very natural looking night skies and very natural looking night mode shots in general. It is something that they basically fine-tuned, and I can't be more glad about it because sure, we don't have access to color profiles, that's fine. As long as you can provide me with near flawless images, I don't mind. Well, near flawless in the sense that the colors look really nice, the contrast is balanced almost perfectly. The exposure is about as good as it can get on both phones, to be honest, because both phones are producing very natural, very nice looking night mode shots. What about detail preservation though? Because that's where things get particularly interesting, especially on the X200 Ultra. Because regular detail preservation, as you can probably tell right here, it's good on both. On one hand, we have the X200 Ultra, which does produce more detail and also a lot more sharpening. Like that is a significant amount of sharpening. On the S25 Ultra, on the other hand, far less detail, far more smearing, but less sharpening, so less processing in general. That's just the way it is. But more than anything else, what is very interesting about the X200 Ultra is that Vivo decided to integrate high resolution, Zest Natural Colors, or any other color profile actually, and night mode all together. I'm gonna let you guys imagine how good that's gonna look because that's exactly what we have here, and wow, it is glorious to say the least. Yes, maybe the detail preservation could be a little bit more fine-tuned here and there, so on and so forth. There's a various number of things that can be improved upon, but what we have is a beautiful thing, and honestly the S25 doesn't really compare. At least if you're using main camera high-res with night mode, well, it's quite something to behold. Now when it comes to the ultrawide camera, things get that much more interesting because I would firmly consider, especially for daylight photography, the X200 Ultra is the best series with the ultrawide. The S25 is a very close second because simply the fact that its detail preservation is not that good. That's all there is. At night, of course, the colors are very good, as you can probably tell. Like the contrast balance is so beautifully fine-tuned on the S25 Ultra. I have nothing to complain about. But I do believe that sometimes highlights can be blown out a little too much on the S25. And that is very unfortunate because that is once again something that Vivo just nails every single time. However, of course, we got to talk about detail preservation because the ultrawide camera is, of course, some of the best in the industry. We got to compare it even at night. And at night, yeah, the X200 Ultra does perform much better as opposed to the S25 Ultra. This is not even like the worst lighting condition. I think both phones just took a 1 second exposure. However, you can also take high-res ultra-wide night mode on the X200 Ultra. As you would have probably guessed, is going to perform even better. But I don't think it's all that worth taking on the X200 Ultra because the regular detail preservation is so good and very few people are going to bother with slight differences in detail preservation with ultra-wide shots. I think it's much more worthwhile taking main camera and the 3.7x telephoto camera shots with high res. But of course, you have the option, you can do whatever you want with it. Now of course, speaking of the telephoto cameras, let's take a quick look at the 3x, which I know for a fact that it's not going to perform all that well, but just for the sake of science and just for the sake of completion of this comparison, let's zoom in and take a look. Yes, just as we expected, the X200 Ultra is significantly better. It has some processing, obviously, everything has processing in there, but it is performing far better as opposed to the S25 because the sensor is just not good on the S25, the 3x that is. The 5x on the other hand, far better, which is exactly what we have here. And essentially the 5x sensor is a lot better, but in this case we are also utilizing the X200 Ultra's high-res 3.7x telephoto with night mode. I know it's a mouthful, but at the end of the day, it can produce some tremendous shots, as you can probably guess. Now I did match up the framing to make this as fair of a comparison as possible, and zooming all the way in, I think it's pretty obvious that the X200 Ultra is just going to perform better. Whether it's the 50 megapixel mode or the 200 megapixel mode, which yes, you can also do that, and it does produce slightly better results as opposed to the 50 megapixel, just like we saw previously. But at the end of the day, when it comes to detail preservation, I sincerely doubt there's anything else I can keep up with the X200 Ultra. So with all of that said, yes, kind of as you might have expected, I believe that the X200 Ultra is in general just going to be better for regular photography. Now there are definitely areas where it can improve. We have seen a lot of processing problems, we have seen a lot of over sharpening that can happen on the X200 Ultra. I know you can lower the sharpness amount on the X200 Ultra, but I feel like it doesn't really do much about the over processing problem. It just makes it look a little smeary as opposed to sharpened, which, you know, either of those is not exactly a welcome change now, is it? It's something that needs to be fine-tuned by Vivo in the back end or in the software department. And well, it's something that has always been there and it's always going to be a problem. Overprocessing, underprocessing, all that stuff is always going to be an issue, alright? That's the best way to put it. Now, more than anything else, what I do believe is that the S25 Ultra, you see, in taillight photography, everything is fine up until you go for a warm lit situation. That's where I think it suffers more than anything else. Like yes, when you nitpick and you pixel peep, you're going to find detail differences, and as I mentioned, nothing can come close to the Vivo. So in a manner of speaking, it's like an unfair comparison, but it's really not. However, if the warm tones were good and accurate on the S25 Ultra, I would not be all that worried, and I would very easily say that, you know, you can go for the S25 Ultra, you'll just get slightly less detail, maybe a little bit of smearing if you zoom in all the way. But that's not the case now, is it? With those warm tone problems, it's hard to recommend the S25 Ultra over the X200 Ultra, just in terms of regular photography. I'm talking about this in like a void where none of the other problems surround the X200 Ultra with, you know, importing it and the software not being fine-tuned for global launch. All that jazz doesn't exist. That's basically the way I'm putting it, just to be very clear. So in essence, what we have is the X200 Ultra being definitively better than the S25 Ultra. That was definitively obvious, but I do think it was closer than what many people would have imagined. Plain and simple. Essentially, I thought it would be a much wider difference, and it wasn't. Best way to put it. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and yes, humans have just comparison coming soon. Cheers.